The scream came from the stable before the sun had even finished rising. Elara Whitmore dropped the bucket of water she was carrying and ran toward the sound, her boots slipping on the wet grass. She had only been at Ashcombe Hall for 2 days, and already she understood one rule better than any other. Nobody went near the black stallion named Solomon unless they wanted to lose a hand. When she reached the stable, she found Gideon Hale pressed against the wooden wall, his sleeve torn and his face pale. The horse stood at the far end of his stall, nostrils flaring, front hoof striking the ground hard enough to shake dust from the beams above. "Stay back," Gideon warned, though his voice shook more than hers did. "That beast near took my arm off." Elara stayed exactly where she was told, but her eyes stayed on the horse. He was beautiful in a way that made her chest tighten, black from nose to tail, with a wildness in his eyes that looked less like anger and more like grief. She had seen that look before, on people who had lost something they could never get back. "He has been like this since the old Duchess passed," said a voice behind her. Elara turned to find Odette Marsh, the head housekeeper, standing with a basket of linens balanced on her hip. Odette was the only person at Ashcombe Hall who had spoken to Elara with any real warmth since she arrived. "Nobody has ridden him in 8 months. Nobody has even brushed him properly. The Duke will not allow him to be sold, and he will not allow him to be put down, so the poor animal just stands there suffering." "Why does no one try to help him?" Elara asked. Odette gave a short, tired laugh. "Because the last groom who tried is missing 2 fingers. Because the one before him broke his leg. Solomon does not want help. He wants his mistress back, and she is not coming back." Elara looked at the horse again. He had stopped striking the ground, but his eyes were still fixed on her, steady and unblinking, as if he were studying her the same way she was studying him. Gideon straightened his sleeve and stepped further away from the stall. "You will muck this one out, girl, since you are new and nobody has told you better yet. Just do it quick, and do not look him in the eye." Elara nodded, though her stomach twisted. She had come to Ashcombe Hall with nothing but a letter of recommendation from a family that no longer wished to keep her, and she could not afford to lose this position on her very first week. She picked up her rake and stepped carefully toward the stall door, expecting at any moment to hear the horse charge. He did not move. She opened the door slowly, keeping her body low and her voice soft, murmuring nonsense words the way she used to murmur to the frightened dogs behind her old employer's kitchen. Solomon's ears flicked toward her, but his hooves stayed still. She worked quickly, raking out the old straw, careful never to turn her back on him for too long, and the entire time his dark eyes followed her without a single sign of the fury Gideon had described. When she finished, she risked one glance directly at him. "You are not angry," she whispered. "You are only lonely." The horse let out a long breath through his nose, almost like a sigh, and Elara felt something in her chest loosen for the first time since she had arrived at this cold, enormous house. She did not know that she was being watched. From the study window above the stable yard, Duke Julian Ashcombe stood with a glass of untouched brandy in his hand, staring down at the new stable girl with an expression he could not name. He had seen every attempt made on that horse in the past 8 months, had heard every scream, had signed every apology to every injured groom. He had begun to believe that Solomon's grief was permanent, a mirror of his own, and that nothing and no one would ever reach the animal again. Yet here was a girl he barely knew the name of, standing calm as still water beside the most dangerous horse on the estate, and the horse had not so much as bared his teeth. Julian set down his glass and told himself it meant nothing. Coincidence. Luck. He returned to his ledgers and did not look out the window again that morning, though he found his eyes drifting toward the stable more than once before noon. By the time Elara finished her chores that evening, her arms ached and her dress was streaked with dirt, but she felt lighter than she had in months. She had a roof over her head, food that did not need to be begged for, and a strange, quiet friendship growing with a horse that terrified everyone else on the estate. She was walking back toward the servants' quarters when Lady Corinne Ashcombe stepped into her path, her silk skirts rustling against the gravel. "You are the new girl," Corinne said, looking Elara over, the way one might look at an insect that had wandered too far into the house. "The orphan." "Yes, my lady. I hear you went near Solomon today and came away with all your fingers." Corinne's smile did not reach her eyes. "How fortunate for you. Do be careful, girl. Fortune has a way of running out." She swept past without waiting for a reply, and Elara stood there a moment longer, feeling the chill of the words settle over her like the evening air. She did not yet know why Lady Corinne's gaze had lingered so long, or why the warning had sounded less like concern and more like a threat, but she filed it away all the same. That night, unable to sleep in the narrow servant's bed, Ilara slipped out of the house and made her way back to the stable. The moon was high, and the yard was silent except for the occasional shift of hooves against straw. She found Solomon standing near the front of his stall, awake, watching the door as though he had been expecting her. "I should not be here," she whispered, glancing back toward the house. "If anyone finds me, I will be dismissed before I have even earned my first wage." Solomon lowered his great head over the stall door, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath. She reached out slowly, giving him every chance to pull away, and rested her palm against the side of his face. He did not flinch. He did not strike. He simply stood there, eyes half closed, leaning gently into her touch like a creature starved for something as simple as kindness. "You miss her," Ilara said softly. "I know what that feels like. I miss people too, people who are never coming back." The horse's ears swiveled toward her voice, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Then, slowly, deliberately, Solomon bent his front legs and lowered himself down until his knees touched the straw, his great head bowed low before her, as if the wild and untouchable stallion of Ashcombe Hall were kneeling. Ilara froze, too stunned to breathe. She had heard the stories, the whispers among the staff that Solomon had once done tricks for the old Duchess, that he had loved her enough to bow before her like a knight before his lady. She had never imagined he would do the same for a stranger. A sound from the shadows made her spin around, heart hammering. Duke Julian stood at the edge of the stable yard, still dressed from dinner, his riding cloak thrown over one shoulder as though he had been walking the grounds and stopped without meaning to. He was staring at the horse, at the impossible sight of Solomon kneeling in the moonlight, and then he was staring at her. Neither of them spoke. Ilara's hand was still resting on the horse's bowed head, and she did not dare move it, as if breaking the moment might shatter whatever fragile magic had brought it into being. Julian took one slow step forward, then another, his eyes never leaving the animal. "He has not done that," he said quietly, "since my mother died." Ilara did not know what to say, so she said nothing at all. "You should not be out here at this hour," Julian continued, though there was no anger in his voice, only something quieter, something that sounded almost like disbelief. "It is not safe. He is not safe. Or he was not, until tonight." "I only wanted to sit with him," Ilara said. He looked so alone. Julian studied her for a long moment, the moonlight catching the sharp lines of his face, and Ilara felt suddenly very aware of how she must look. Dirt still under her fingernails, hair coming loose from its pins, a stable girl caught somewhere she had no right to be. "Go inside," he said finally, "before someone else sees you here." She curtsied quickly, gave Solomon one last gentle pat, and hurried back toward the house, her heart pounding the entire way, not from fear, but from something else entirely, something she could not yet put a name to. Julian remained in the yard long after she had gone, staring at the stallion that had finally risen back to his feet and was now watching the door through which the girl had disappeared. He thought of his mother, of the long months of grief that had turned this house into a place of silence and locked doors, and he thought of the way the horse's dark eyes had softened the moment the girl touched him. He told himself it was nothing, a trick of the moonlight, an accident that would not repeat itself. But as he turned to walk back toward the house, he found himself already wondering when he might see her out there again. Morning came too quickly for Ilara, and with it came the fear that she had ruined everything. She dressed in silence, replaying the scene in the stable yard over and over in her mind, certain that the Duke would dismiss her before breakfast was even served. A stable girl wandering the grounds at midnight, alone with the most dangerous horse on the estate, caught by the master of the house himself. There was no version of that story that ended well for someone in her position. She kept her head down as she crossed the yard, expecting Gideon or Odette to stop her at any moment with news of her dismissal. Instead, she found a folded note tucked beneath the handle of the stable door, addressed simply to "the new girl," in handwriting too neat and too careful to belong to any of the grooms. She unfolded it with trembling fingers. "You will care for Solomon each morning from now on. No one else is to enter his stall. This is not a request." There was no signature, but she did not need one. She looked up toward the house, toward the tall windows of the study, and thought she saw a shadow move away from the glass. Gideon was furious when he learned of the arrangement. He cornered her near the feed room later that morning, his face red with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. 2 days, he snapped. "You have been here 2 days, and already the Duke hands you the one horse none of us are allowed to touch. Do you know how that looks? Do you know what people will say?" "I did not ask for this," Ilara said quietly, though she could feel her own pulse quicken with something that was not quite fear and not quite excitement. "Doesn't matter what you asked for, it matters what you got. Gideon leaned closer, lowering his voice. Be careful, girl. This house has a way of chewing up people who get too comfortable too fast. You are an orphan with no family and no name that means anything. The Duke can send you away with a word, and no one would blink twice. He stormed off before she could answer, leaving her standing alone with the note still clutched in her hand. She spent the rest of the morning proving herself worthy of the trust she had not asked for. Solomon allowed her to brush the tangles from his mane, to check his hooves, to lead him in slow circles around the paddock while the other grooms watched from a safe distance, murmuring to one another in tones she could not quite hear but could easily imagine. By midday, word had spread through the entire staff. The wild horse was gentle for the orphan girl. Some called it a miracle. Others called it something far less kind. Lady Corinne watched from the terrace with narrowed eyes, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. Her son, Percival, sat beside her, sulking over a letter that had arrived that morning informing him that his allowance would not be increased despite his repeated requests. Do you see that? Corinne asked, nodding toward the paddock. The stable girl. Julian has given her Solomon. Percival glanced up, unimpressed. It is only a horse, mother. It is never only a horse in this family, Corinne said sharply. That animal was his mother's shadow. If Julian is softening toward the girl who tamed it, then we have a problem. She set down her cup with a decisive click against the saucer. I did not spend the last 3 years positioning you as his rightful heir, only to watch some penniless orphan wander in and undo it because she has a gentle hand with horses. What would you have me do? Corinne's eyes stayed fixed on the paddock, on the girl laughing softly as the horse nuzzled her shoulder, on the way Julian himself had appeared at the edge of the yard, watching the same scene with an expression she had not seen on his face in a very long time. Nothing, for now, she said. We watch, we wait, and when the moment comes, we make certain she has no place left in this house to stand. Julian did not know how long he had been standing at the edge of the paddock before Elara noticed him. She startled slightly when she caught sight of him, dropping into a quick curtsy that made Solomon shift uneasily beside her. Your Grace, she said, I did not hear you approach. You seem to have a gift, Julian said, ignoring the formality, his eyes on the horse rather than on her. He has not let anyone else touch him in 8 months, not the grooms, not the stable master, not even me. I do not know what I am doing differently, Elara admitted. I only listen to him. He seems to want someone who is not afraid. Everyone is afraid of him. I am not afraid of grief, Elara said simply. I have lived inside it long enough to recognize it in others. Something in Julian's expression shifted, a flicker of surprise quickly smoothed over by the careful composure he wore like armor. You speak boldly for a servant. Forgive me, Your Grace, I did not mean to overstep. You did not overstep, he said, and to her surprise, there was no sharpness in his voice at all. You simply said something true. Most people in this house have forgotten how to do that. He stepped closer to the paddock fence, resting his forearms against the top rail, and for a long moment, the two of them simply stood together in silence, watching Solomon graze in the afternoon sun, as though the past 8 months of grief and violence had never happened. My mother used to ride him every morning, Julian said eventually, his voice quieter now, almost as if he were speaking to himself rather than to her. Before the sun was fully up, she said the world looked kinder from his back, before anyone else was awake to spoil it. He paused. After she died, I could not bring myself to sell him or put him away in some distant pasture. I told myself I was preserving her memory. I think, in truth, I simply could not bear to lose anything else. Elara did not know what compelled her to speak so freely to a man so far above her station, but the words came before she could stop them. Grief does not ask permission before it settles into a house, Your Grace. It simply stays until someone finds the courage to open a window and let some air back in. Julian turned to look at her then, really look at her, and Elara felt her cheeks warm under the intensity of his gaze. Perhaps you have opened one already, he said quietly, nodding toward Solomon, who had wandered close enough to rest his head against her shoulder once more. The moment was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps. A young stable boy came running across the yard, breathless, clutching his cap in both hands. Your Grace, forgive me, but there is trouble at the east fence. 2 of the mares have gotten loose onto the road. Julian's expression hardened instantly, the softness of a moment ago folding back into the composed authority of a duke with an estate to run. See that they are found before nightfall, he said. I will come at once. He turned to leave, then paused, glancing back at Elara one last time. Thank you, he said simply, for what you have done with him. And then he was gone, striding across the yard with the stable boy hurrying to keep pace beside him, leaving Alara alone with the horse and a strange, unfamiliar warmth blooming in her chest that she did not know what to do with. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. Each morning, Alara rose before the rest of the household and made her way to the stable, where Solomon waited for her at the door of his stall as though he had been listening for her footsteps. She brushed him, fed him, walked him through the paddock, and slowly, without either of them quite noticing how it happened, their mornings became the best part of her day. She began to notice Julian more often too, appearing at the edge of the yard on some pretense or another, always with a reason ready should anyone ask why the Duke of Ashcombe found himself so frequently near the stables at dawn. He never stayed long, he never said much. But he watched, and Alara found herself glancing toward the house more often than she would admit, hoping to catch a glimpse of him watching back. Odette noticed first, of course. She noticed everything. "You are smiling more," the housekeeper observed one evening as she helped Alara mend a torn hem in the small sitting room reserved for the female staff. "I have not seen a smile like that on a girl in this house in a very long time." "I do not know what you mean," Alara said, though her cheeks betrayed her. Odette's needle moved steadily, her eyes flicking up with a knowing look. "Be careful, dear girl. A duke's attention is a beautiful and dangerous thing. It can lift a person up higher than they ever imagined, or it can drop them from a height they never survive." She reached over and patted Alara's hand gently. "I only say this because I have watched this house swallow people whole before. I would hate to watch it happen to you." Alara thought of Lady Corinne's cold smile in the gravel path, of the warning tucked inside her pleasant words. She thought of Gideon's suspicion, of the whispers among the staff that followed her now wherever she walked. And she thought of Julian's face in the moonlight, the way he had looked at Solomon kneeling before her, as though the whole world had shifted slightly on its axis. "I will be careful," she promised, though even as she said it, she was not entirely certain it was a promise she could keep. That night, as she walked back from the stable after checking on Solomon one final time, she noticed a light still burning in the study window above the yard. She paused at the edge of the gravel path, looking up at that single lit window, wondering if he was standing there now, looking down. She did not wave, she did not call out, she simply stood there a moment longer than she needed to, and then continued on toward the servants' quarters, carrying with her a small, fragile hope she was not yet ready to name. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, sealed with wax the color of dried blood, and it was addressed not to Julian but to Lady Corinne, delivered by a writer who refused to say who had sent him. Corinne read it twice in the privacy of her chambers, her jaw tightening with each line. It was from a solicitor in London, a man she had quietly retained months ago to search the records for any information on the girl calling herself Alara Whitmore. Most of what he had found was unremarkable. An orphan raised in a modest household 2 counties away, dismissed from her last position under circumstances the letter described only as irregular. But one line near the bottom of the page caught Corinne's attention and refused to let go. The girl's mother, before her death, had once been employed in this very house, decades earlier, as a companion to the old Duchess's own mother. Corinne set the letter down slowly, her mind working through the implications. It was likely nothing more than coincidence, the kind of small, tangled connection that occurred often enough among families whose paths crossed through service and circumstance. But coincidence was a dangerous word in a house built on inheritance and bloodlines, and Corinne had learned long ago that even the smallest thread, pulled at the right moment, could unravel something far larger than anyone expected. She folded the letter carefully and locked it away in her writing desk, deciding to keep it close until the moment it might prove useful. Meanwhile, in the stable yard, Alara's world had grown steadily brighter despite the shadows gathering around its edges. Solomon had improved beyond anything the staff believed possible. He allowed the stable boys to bring hay near his stall without flinching. He tolerated Gideon's presence, though he still pinned his ears whenever the older groom raised his voice, and each morning, without fail, he waited for Alara at the door of his stall, ears pricked forward, as though counting the minutes until she arrived. Julian had taken to riding again, something he had not done since his mother's death, though never on Solomon. He rode a steady bay mare instead, always at a distance that allowed him to pass near the paddock where Alara worked, always with some excuse ready should anyone question the timing. It was Odette who finally spoke plainly to him, cornering the Duke one evening in the corridor outside his study, with the boldness only a woman who had served the family for 30 years could manage. "You are transparent, Your Grace," she said, not unkindly. "The entire staff has noticed. You ride past that paddock more mornings than you do not." Julian's expression flickered with something close to embarrassment, quickly hidden behind the composed mask he wore so well. "I am simply monitoring the horse's progress." Of course you are, Odette said, her tone dry enough that he could not mistake her meaning. And I am simply an old woman, with too much time and too little to occupy it. She softened then, stepping closer, lowering her voice. She is a good girl, Julian. Kind, and honest, and stronger than she looks. But she has no family, no name, no protection in this world beyond what she earns with her own 2 hands. If your attention toward her is more than curiosity about a horse, I would ask you to consider carefully what that attention might cost her, should it become known. Julian was quiet for a long moment. I have considered it, he said finally, more than you know. And I do not yet have an answer, he admitted. Only more questions than I had before she arrived. Odette studied him a moment longer, then nodded once, as though satisfied with an honesty she had not expected. Then be careful with those questions, Your Grace. This house does not forgive carelessness easily, not from a duke, and certainly not from a girl with nothing to protect her but her own good name. The warning stayed with Julian longer than he expected, following him through the rest of the evening and into the quiet hours of the night, when sleep refused to come, and he found himself once again standing at his study window, looking down at the darkened stable yard. He thought of his mother, of the years he had spent learning to be the kind of duke she believed he could become, steady and fair and unshaken by sentiment. He thought of the months since her death, the silence that had settled over Ashcombe Hall like a fog that refused to lift. And he thought of the girl who had walked into that silence 2 weeks ago and, without seeming to try, had begun to clear it away one small act of kindness at a time. He did not know what to call the feeling growing in his chest whenever he watched her with Solomon. He only knew that it frightened him more than any business decision, any negotiation, any responsibility he had inherited along with his title. Those things he understood. This, he did not. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Ashcombe Hall, a neighboring landowner named Edmund Carow, arriving with his unmarried daughter in tow, and an invitation to dinner that Julian had clearly forgotten he had extended weeks earlier, before his mother's absence had swallowed his calendar along with everything else. The dinner was a formal affair, candlelight and polished silver and conversation that circled carefully around topics of land and marriage, and the futures of great families. Miss Carow was polite, well-spoken, and entirely uninterested in horses or stable girls or anything beyond securing a favorable match for herself, and Julian found his attention wandering more than once toward the window, toward the darkened yard beyond it, toward a girl who was at that very moment likely tending to a horse that trusted no one else in the world. Lady Corinne watched the entire evening with sharp, careful eyes, noting every glance Julian sent toward the window. Every moment his mind seemed to drift from the conversation at hand. When the guests finally departed, she found him alone in the study, staring into a fire that had burned low. Miss Carow is a suitable match, she said without preamble. Her family's land borders ours to the north. The union would secure water rights that have been in dispute for 2 generations. I am aware of the benefits, Corinne. Are you also aware of how it will look, should word spread that the Duke of Ashcombe has developed an attachment to a stable girl with no family and no fortune, while suitable young women of good breeding sit waiting for his attention? Julian's jaw tightened. I have developed no such attachment. Then you will not object, Corinne said smoothly. If I arrange for the girl to be reassigned, kitchen work perhaps, or laundry, somewhere further from the stable, and further from you. Solomon will not tolerate anyone else, Julian said, sharper than he intended. You know this. Every groom who has tried has been injured. Then perhaps, Corinne said, watching him carefully, it is time to consider whether keeping that horse at all is worth the trouble it continues to cause this family. Julian said nothing, but the look he gave her was answer enough, and Corinne retreated from the room with a small, satisfied smile that had nothing to do with victory, and everything to do with the certainty that she had found, at last, the exact place to apply pressure when the time came. Ilara knew nothing of the conversation that had taken place in the study that night, but she felt the shift in the house nonetheless, the way a change in weather could be sensed on the skin before the first cloud ever appeared on the horizon. Gideon grew colder toward her. The other stable hands whispered when she passed, and one afternoon, as she led Solomon back from the paddock, she found Lady Corinne waiting near the stable door, her expression pleasant in a way that did not reach her eyes. You have quite a talent, Corinne said, studying the horse rather than the girl. It is remarkable, really, how quickly you have made yourself indispensable to this household. I only do my work, my lady. Of course. Corinne's smile widened slightly. Tell me, Ilara, do you know anything of your mother's history? Before she had you, I mean. Before circumstances brought her so low. The question landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through Alara's chest that she could not quite explain. My mother died when I was young, my lady. I know very little of her life before me. How curious, Corinne said softly. I imagine you will learn more, in time. Histories have a way of surfacing, especially in houses as old as this one. She reached out and patted Solomon's neck once, an oddly proprietary gesture, before turning to walk away. Enjoy your work, girl. While it lasts. Alara stood frozen in the stable doorway long after Corinne had disappeared around the corner of the house, her mother's memory suddenly feeling less like a private sorrow and more like a door someone else was preparing to open without her permission. That evening, unable to shake the unease Corinne's words had planted in her, Alara found herself once again drawn to the stable after the rest of the house had gone quiet. Solomon greeted her with a soft nicker, pressing his head against her shoulder the moment she stepped inside his stall. Something is coming, she whispered to him, resting her forehead against his warm neck. I do not know what it is, but I can feel it, the way you must have felt the change before your mistress died. The horse shifted closer, as if in answer, and for a long while Alara simply stood there in the quiet dark, drawing what comfort she could from the one creature in the entire house, who asked nothing of her except her presence. She did not hear the footsteps until they were nearly upon her. You keep unusual hours, Julian said from the stall door, his voice low in the darkness. Alara startled, straightening quickly. Your Grace, forgive me. I did not mean to be found here so late. I am not upset that you are here, he said, stepping closer, close enough that she could see the tension in his face, even in the dim light of the single lantern hanging near the door. I am upset by what I overheard this afternoon. Corinne's questions about your mother. Alara's stomach tightened. You heard that? Enough of it. Julian's hands rested on the top of the stall door, his knuckles pale against the dark wood. I do not know what she is searching for, Alara, but I know my cousin well enough to recognize when she is building toward something. I would ask that you tell me, if you know anything at all about a connection between your family and mine, before she finds a way to use it against you. Alara shook her head slowly. I know nothing, Your Grace. My mother never spoke of her life before me. I always assumed it was simply too painful for her to revisit. Julian studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened, the tension easing just slightly. Then we will face whatever comes together, he said quietly, when it comes. The word together settled over Alara like a warmth she had not felt in years, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the only sound in the stable the soft rustle of Solomon shifting his weight in the straw behind her. Your Grace, she said finally, may I ask you something? You may. Why do you keep finding reasons to be near this stable? The question came out bolder than she intended, and she immediately wished she could take it back, but Julian did not look angry. He looked, if anything, relieved to finally be asked directly. Because, he said slowly, choosing each word with care, I find that I am drawn here, and I have run out of excuses that explain why beyond the truth. And what is the truth? Julian's eyes held hers in the lantern light, steady and unguarded in a way she had not seen from him before. The truth, he said quietly, is that I have not felt this alive in 8 months, and I believe you are the reason. Alara's breath caught, and for a long, suspended moment, the world outside the stable seemed to fall away entirely, leaving only the two of them, the horse and the fragile, dangerous thing blooming quietly between them in the dark. The accusation came at breakfast, loud enough for the entire kitchen staff to hear. Witchcraft, Gideon said, slamming his cup down on the wooden table hard enough to send tea sloshing over the rim. There is no other explanation for it. That horse near killed me with his teeth, and now he follows her around the paddock like a lamb. I have worked with animals my whole life, and I have never seen the like, not once. The younger stable boys exchanged uneasy glances. One of the kitchen maids made a small, superstitious gesture with her fingers, murmuring something under her breath. Alara, standing near the doorway with a tray of feed buckets in her arms, felt the weight of every eye in the room settle on her at once. That is a serious word to use, Gideon, Odette said sharply, stepping between him and the door. Choose your accusations more carefully, or choose them somewhere the Duke can hear you make them. I would say it to his face gladly. Gideon shot back. Something is not right about that girl. She arrives with nothing, no family, no name worth speaking of, and within a fortnight, she has the master's own horse eating from her hand, and the master himself finding reasons to linger by the stable at all hours. You cannot tell me that is ordinary. It is called kindness, Odette said, her voice cold enough to cut through the tension in the room. Something you might try. If you are so eager to understand why an animal responds better to gentleness than to the temper you have shown him since the day he arrived. Gideon opened his mouth to argue further, but the words died in his throat as the kitchen door swung open and Julian himself stepped inside, still dressed in his riding clothes, his expression thunderous in a way none of the staff had seen since his mother's funeral. "I would like to know," Julian said, his voice quiet but carrying easily across the suddenly silent room, "who among you has been using the word witchcraft in my kitchen?" No one spoke. Gideon's face had gone pale, the bravado of a moment ago draining out of him entirely under the weight of the Duke's gaze. "I asked a question," Julian said, stepping further into the room. "I expect an answer." "It was me, Your Grace," Gideon said finally, his voice smaller than it had been moments before. "I only meant that the horse's change is unnatural. I meant no harm by it." "You accused a member of my household staff of practicing dark arts," Julian said, in front of a room full of impressionable young ears, "based on nothing more than your own wounded pride at being shown gentler methods than the ones you have relied upon for years, and have clearly failed with. That is not an observation, Gideon. That is cruelty dressed up as concern. Your Grace, Alara has done nothing but her work," Julian continued, cutting him off, "and she has done it better than anyone else on this estate has managed in 8 months. If you cannot find it in yourself to respect that, you are welcome to seek employment elsewhere. Ashcombe Hall has no use for staff who spread superstition and fear among their fellows." The silence that followed was absolute, but Gideon nodded stiffly, mumbled an apology that satisfied no one, and excused himself from the room as quickly as dignity allowed. The rest of the staff returned to their duties with unusual haste, none of them quite willing to meet the Duke's eyes, and within minutes the kitchen had emptied entirely, leaving only Julian, Alara, and Odette standing amid the aftermath. "Thank you, Your Grace," Alara said quietly once the others had gone. "You did not need to defend me so publicly." "I did," Julian said simply. "I should have done it sooner. I have let this house whisper and speculate for weeks now, and I let my own hesitation keep me from putting a stop to it. That was a mistake I do not intend to repeat." Odette, watching the exchange with a knowing look she did not bother to hide, quietly gathered the abandoned tea things and slipped out of the room, leaving the two of them alone amid the quiet clatter of the kitchen settling back into stillness. "The staff will talk regardless," Alara said. "Public defense or not, I am not naive about what this looks like, Your Grace. A duke, defending a stable girl in front of the entire household. Let them talk." Julian's voice was steady, resolute in a way she had not heard from him before. "I am tired of living my life according to what this house whispers behind closed doors. I did that for 8 months after my mother died, and it brought me nothing but silence, and a horse too grief-stricken to be touched." He paused, studying her carefully. "You changed that. I will not pretend otherwise simply because it is inconvenient for people like Gideon or my cousin to accept." Alara felt her cheeks warm, though she was not certain if it was from the words themselves or the way he said them, plain and unguarded, as though he had stopped caring who might overhear. "Your mother must have been a remarkable woman," she said softly, "to leave behind a grief so deep that even her horse could not recover from it." Something shifted in Julian's expression, a flicker of old pain quickly followed by something gentler. "Would you like to know about her?" he asked. "I do not often speak of her, not truly. Everyone in this house treats her memory like something fragile, something to be handled carefully and set aside. I find I would rather remember her the way she actually was." "I would like that very much," Alara said. They walked together toward the paddock, and as they walked, Julian spoke of his mother, in a way Alara suspected he had not spoken to anyone since the funeral. He told her of early mornings spent riding before the household woke, of a woman who had insisted on learning every tenant's name on the estate and every child's birthday, who had once ridden 3 hours in the rain to sit beside a dying farmhand simply so he would not be alone at the end. He told her of the fever that had taken her within a week, sudden and merciless, leaving the entire estate reeling from a loss no one had time to prepare for. "Solomon was hers before he was ever mine," Julian said, watching the stallion graze peacefully in the afternoon sun. "She raised him from a colt. He was barely more than a foal when she started riding him herself, against everyone's advice. She used to say he understood her better than most people did." He paused. "When she died, he simply stopped eating properly for a time, stopped allowing anyone near him, stopped being the animal she had spent years gentling into something remarkable. I think, in his own way, he grieved her exactly as hard as I did." "And you could not bear to lose him too," Alara said quietly, understanding settling over her at last. "So you kept him, even suffering, rather than let him go the way you had already lost her. Julian's eyes met hers, surprised by how precisely she had named something he had never fully admitted even to himself. Yes, he said simply. That is exactly it. He is not suffering any longer, Ilara said, nodding toward Solomon, who had lifted his head at the sound of their voices, and was now making his way slowly toward the paddock fence. Grief does not disappear entirely, Your Grace. I do not believe it ever truly does, but it can soften, given enough patience and enough gentleness. I believe he has begun to heal. I believe perhaps you have too. Julian watched the horse approach, watched him press his great head against Ilara's shoulder with the same easy trust he showed every morning now, and felt something loosen in his own chest that had been tightly wound since the day his mother died. I owe you a debt I am not certain I can repay, he said quietly. You owe me nothing, Your Grace. I only did what felt right. Perhaps. Julian's gaze lingered on her a moment longer than propriety allowed. But I intend to find a way regardless. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the upstairs window, Lady Corinne's silhouette rigid against the glass, her expression unreadable as she observed the easy warmth between the Duke and the stable girl he had so publicly defended that morning. She turned away from the window after a long moment, crossed to her writing desk, and unlocked the drawer where the solicitor's letter still waited, unfolded, its contents already committed to memory. It was time, she decided, to write another letter, one that would set in motion the plan she had been quietly assembling since the day she first learned of the connection between Ilara's mother and the history of Ashcombe Hall. She had hoped it would not come to this. She had hoped Julian would grow bored of the stable girl on his own, the way he had grown bored of every passing infatuation before it. But watching the two of them together in the paddock, she understood with sudden clarity that this was not a passing infatuation. This was something far more dangerous to the careful future she had spent years constructing for her son. She dipped her pen in ink and began to write, each word chosen with the precision of a woman who had learned long ago that the most effective weapons were rarely loud and were almost always disguised as concern. The silver was found beneath the loose floorboard of Ilara's small room 3 days later, wrapped carefully in a cloth that did not belong to her, tucked away with a precision that suggested it had been placed there by someone who wanted it found rather than hidden. It was Odette who discovered it, sent by the housekeeper's own instinct that something in the household had shifted, some quiet wrongness she could not name but had learned over 30 years of service never to ignore. She lifted the floorboard on a hunch, following whispers that had begun circulating among the staff that morning, whispers that claimed a piece of the family's old silver had gone missing from the locked cabinet in the dining room, and there it was, gleaming faintly in the dim light of Ilara's room, exactly where someone had wanted it to be seen. Odette's hands shook as she wrapped it back up, her mind racing through every possibility, all of them troubling. She knew Ilara well enough by now to know the girl would never steal, not from this house, not from anyone, but knowing a truth and proving it were two very different things, and she understood immediately how this would look to anyone less familiar with the girl's character. She was not surprised, an hour later, to hear that Lady Corinne had personally requested the room be searched, citing concerns she claimed had been building for weeks. Ilara was summoned to the study that afternoon, her heart pounding the entire walk from the stable, Solomon's anxious whinny following her across the yard, as though he sensed something was terribly wrong. She found Julian standing behind his desk, his face carefully composed, and Lady Corinne seated in a chair near the window, her expression a careful mask of regret that did not quite hide the satisfaction underneath. A piece of silver has gone missing from the dining room, Julian said, his voice tight with an effort at neutrality that Ilara could hear straining at the edges. It was found in your room. I did not take it, Ilara said immediately, the words rushing out before she could stop them. Your Grace, I swear to you, I have never touched anything in this house that was not mine to touch. That is precisely what a thief would say, Corinne said gently, as though the words pained her to speak. I do not wish to believe it of you either, Ilara, but the evidence is difficult to ignore. Someone placed it there, Ilara said, turning desperately toward Julian. I do not know who, or why, but I did not put it there myself. You must believe me. Julian's jaw tightened, and for a long, agonizing moment he said nothing at all, and Ilara felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, felt every fragile piece of trust they had built over the past weeks, trembling under the weight of this single accusation. She searched his face for some sign of the man who had defended her in the kitchen days earlier, who had spoken to her of his mother in the golden afternoon light, who had told her plainly that she had made him feel alive again after 8 months of grief. I want to believe you, Julian said finally, his voice quieter now. But I cannot ignore evidence found in your own room, Ilara, not when my cousin has raised the concern publicly, and not when the entire household is waiting to see how I respond. Then what happens to me? Ilara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. There will need to be an inquiry, Julian said, and she could hear how much the words cost him. Until it is resolved, I am afraid you cannot continue your usual duties. You will remain confined to the servants' quarters. Corinne rose from her chair, smoothing her skirts with an air of finality. I have already sent word to the local magistrate, she said. These matters are best resolved quickly, before rumor has a chance to do more damage than the theft itself. Ilara felt the room tilt slightly around her. A magistrate meant more than confinement. It meant the possibility of real consequences, a trial, a punishment far beyond dismissal, for a crime she had never committed. She looked at Julian one last time, searching for some sign that he would stop this, that he would find a way to protect her the way he had promised he would when they last stood together in the stable. Your Grace, she said quietly, please. Julian's expression flickered, torn between two versions of himself, the careful Duke who understood the weight of appearances, and the man who had knelt beside her in the moonlight, watching a grieving horse finally find peace. I will look into this personally, he said finally. I give you my word, Ilara. I will not let an injustice stand in this house, but I need time, and I need you to remain patient while I find the truth of what happened. It was not the rescue she had hoped for, but it was something. A thread of hope thin enough to nearly break but strong enough to hold, and Ilara clung to it as she was led from the study by a stone-faced footman, past whispering staff who parted before her like she carried some contagious illness, back toward the small room where the silver had been so carefully planted. She did not sleep that night. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, replaying every moment of the past weeks, trying to understand who among the household could hate her enough to see her ruined, and arrested, and possibly worse. She thought of Gideon's resentment, of Lady Corinne's cold smiles, of the solicitor's letter she knew nothing about but somehow felt the shadow of pressing down upon her regardless. She did not know that, 3 stalls away in the stable, Solomon had grown increasingly restless the moment she failed to appear that morning, pacing his enclosure, ears pinned, refusing food from the stable boy sent to tend him in her place. By evening, his agitation had grown so severe that 2 grooms were needed simply to keep him from injuring himself against the walls of his stall. It was near midnight when he finally broke free. No one was certain afterward exactly how he managed it, whether the latch had been improperly secured or whether the sheer force of his panic had simply overwhelmed it, but the result was the same. Solomon burst from the stable at a dead run, thundering across the moonlit grounds with a wildness the household had not seen since before Ilara's arrival, ignoring every attempt by the frightened staff to catch him. He came to a stop directly beneath the window of the small room where Ilara sat sleepless, rearing once against the darkness and letting out a scream so loud it woke half the household, before dropping back down and simply standing there, refusing to move, refusing to be caught, staring up at her window as though he somehow knew exactly where she was being kept. Ilara heard the commotion and rushed to her window, her breath catching at the sight of him standing in the moonlit yard below, his coat lathered with sweat, his eyes wild with a distress she recognized immediately as fear for her, rather than fear of anything else. Solomon, she breathed, and before she could think better of it, she was pulling on her boots and hurrying down the servants' stairs, ignoring the footman posted outside her door who called after her in confusion, ignoring every rule that told her she was meant to remain confined. By the time she reached the yard, half the household had gathered, drawn from their beds by the noise, watching in a mixture of alarm and astonishment as the wild stallion refused every attempt to be led back to his stall. Gideon approached with a lead rope and was met with a furious rear that sent him scrambling backward. 2 other grooms tried together and fared no better. Let me, Ilara said, stepping forward. Absolutely not, Gideon snapped, still catching his breath from his near miss. You are meant to be confined, girl. This is exactly the kind of trouble that got you into this mess in the first place. But it was already too late. The moment Solomon caught sight of her, his entire demeanor shifted, the wildness draining out of him as quickly as it had appeared. He crossed the yard to her in a few long strides and lowered his head against her chest, his whole body trembling with what could only be described as relief. You should not have run, she whispered, pressing her forehead against his, tears she had been holding back all night finally spilling free. You could have been hurt. It was in this moment, the entire household gathered and watching, that Julian arrived, drawn from his own sleepless bed by the commotion. still in his nightclothes with a cloak thrown hastily over his shoulders. He stopped short at the sight before him, Alara standing in the moonlit yard with her arms wrapped around the neck of a horse that had just broken free of every restraint in the estate simply to reach her, and something in his chest cracked open entirely. He would not settle, said the stable boy who had been left in charge, hurrying forward with an explanation. Not since she was taken away this morning. We tried everything, Your Grace. He simply would not stop until he found her. Julian crossed the yard slowly, his eyes moving between the horse and the girl, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried clearly across the silent yard for every gathered member of the household to hear. This animal, he said, has trusted exactly one person in this world since the day my mother died. He does not lie. He does not scheme. He does not plant silver beneath floorboards to serve his own ambitions. His gaze moved deliberately toward the edge of the crowd, where Lady Corinne stood in her dressing gown, her expression carefully neutral despite the tension visible in her shoulders. If Solomon trusts her enough to break free of his stall and risk injury, simply to reach her, then I find myself questioning very seriously whether the evidence gathered against her deserves the weight I gave it this afternoon. Your Grace, Corinne began, surely you are not suggesting that the behavior of an animal should outweigh evidence found in the girl's own. I am suggesting, Julian said, cutting her off with a firmness that silenced the entire yard, that I intend to discover exactly how that silver came to be in her room, and I intend to discover it before any magistrate sets foot on this property. Until then, the inquiry is suspended, and Alara will be returned to her usual duties, effective immediately. A murmur rippled through the gathered staff, some relieved, some clearly disappointed at the sudden reversal of the evening's drama. Corinne said nothing further, though the look she gave Alara across the moonlit yard promised this was far from finished. Julian approached slowly, his eyes moving from the horse to the girl still holding tightly to his neck. Are you unhurt? He asked quietly, close enough now that only she could hear him clearly. I am well, Your Grace, Alara said, though her voice trembled slightly with the aftermath of fear and relief tangled together. He came for me. I noticed, Julian said, something like wonder threading through his voice. I have never seen him do anything like this, not even for my mother, and she was the only person alive he trusted before you. What does it mean? Alara asked softly. Julian's eyes held hers in the moonlight, and for a moment the entire household, the accusation, Lady Corinne's watchful gaze, all of it seemed to fall away entirely. I believe, he said quietly. It means he understands something I have been too cautious to say aloud. Solomon shifted between them, nudging his great head gently against Julian's shoulder as though offering his approval, and despite everything that had happened that night, despite the fear and the accusation, and the uncertain danger still hanging over her future in this house, Alara felt, for the first time since the silver had been discovered, something that almost resembled hope. The truth came apart at breakfast, 3 days later, when a young footman named Peter finally found the courage to speak. He had been carrying the guilt since the night the silver appeared, watching Alara suffer through days of confinement and suspicion while he stayed silent out of fear, and it was only after witnessing Solomon's desperate flight across the moonlit yard that his conscience finally overcame his fear. He came forward to Odette first, trembling, confessing that he had been paid a small sum by Lady Corinne's personal maid to place the silver beneath the loose floorboard, told only that it was a harmless prank meant to test the new girl's honesty. He had not known, he insisted, that it would be used to threaten her with a magistrate. Odette brought him directly to Julian, and within the hour the entire scheme had unraveled. The lady's maid, faced with dismissal and the threat of her own prosecution, confirmed everything, naming Lady Corinne as the one who had instructed her, who had provided both the silver and the payment for Peter's silence. Julian summoned his cousin to the study that afternoon, and this time it was Corinne who stood before the desk while Julian remained seated, his expression colder than Alara had ever seen it. You will explain yourself, Julian said, or you will leave this house within the hour. Corinne's composure cracked for the first time since Alara had arrived at Ashcombe Hall. I did what was necessary, she said, her voice tight with something between fury and desperation. You cannot see it, blinded as you are by whatever spell that girl has cast over you, but I have spent years securing Percival's place in this family's future. A stable girl with no name and no fortune threatens everything I have built, and I will not stand by and watch it collapse because you have grown sentimental over a horse and the girl who tamed it. You forged evidence to have an innocent woman arrested, Julian said, his voice deadly quiet. You paid a footman to lie, and you threatened a member of my household with the magistrate over a crime that existed only in your own scheming. There is no justification for that, Corinne. Not ambition, not fear, not anything you might claim on Percival's behalf. She is beneath you, Corinne snapped. An orphan with a mother who worked as a companion 2 generations back. Do you truly believe she belongs at your side, running this estate, bearing the Ashcombe name? The room went very still. What do you know of her mother? Julian asked slowly. Corinne's mouth tightened, realizing too late what she had revealed. It does not matter. It matters a great deal, Julian said, rising from his chair. Tell me now, Corinne, or I will have the solicitor you clearly hired brought here to tell me himself. Faced with no other option, Corinne finally relayed what her investigation had uncovered, that Ilara's mother had once served this very house decades earlier, a companion to the mother of the old Duchess, dismissed under circumstances no one had bothered to record, her departure quiet and unremarkable at the time. It was, in the end, nothing more than a small and ordinary connection, the kind that existed in 100 households across the country, entirely without scandal or significance beyond the strange, quiet symmetry of a daughter returning, generations later, to the same halls her mother had once walked. Julian stood in stunned silence for a long moment, processing the revelation, before something almost like relief crossed his features. This is the great scandal you built an entire scheme around? He asked. A woman who served this family honorably, decades ago? It could have been used against her, Corinne said weakly. Against you, should the connection ever come to light in the wrong company. It is not a scandal, Corinne. It is history. And you nearly destroyed an innocent woman's life to keep it buried, for reasons that exist only in your own ambition. Julian's voice hardened once more. You will leave Ashcombe Hall by morning. Percival may remain, should he wish to make his own way honestly, but you will not stay in this house a moment longer than necessary. Corinne left the study without another word, her face pale with the recognition that her long campaign had finally, irrevocably, failed. Word of the truth spread through the household by evening, and Ilara found herself the recipient of apologies from staff who had doubted her, including a red-faced Gideon, who mumbled his regret with genuine shame before retreating quickly from the kitchen. Odette embraced her tightly, tears in her eyes, whispering that she had known all along the girl was innocent. But it was the quiet moment that followed, once the household had finally settled, and the excitement of the day had faded into evening calm, that Ilara would remember most clearly for the rest of her life. She found Julian in the stable yard, standing beside Solomon in the fading light, one hand resting on the horse's neck, his expression thoughtful as he watched the sun sink below the tree line. You found the truth, she said softly, approaching slowly. I promised I would, Julian said, turning to face her. I do not break promises, Ilara, not to you. She stopped a few feet away, uncertain what to say, the events of the past days still settling strangely in her chest. Julian closed the remaining distance between them himself, his eyes steady on hers in a way that made her breath catch. I have spent 8 months believing I had lost everything worth keeping, he said quietly. My mother, my peace, even this horse, who seemed determined to grieve himself into silence forever. And then you arrived, with nothing but a letter of recommendation and a gentleness this house had forgotten how to recognize, and you brought all of it back, Solomon. This house, me. He paused, his voice softening further. Solomon knew what I was too afraid to admit to myself. He knelt for you the very first night, as though he understood something I would spend weeks trying to talk myself out of. Your Grace, Ilara began, but he shook his head gently. Julian, he said, please, I think we are long past the point of such formality between us. Julian, she said, testing the name, feeling something warm bloom in her chest at the sound of it. What are you saying? I am saying, he said, taking her hand carefully in his, that I do not wish to spend another day pretending this is only about a horse. I love you, Ilara. I believe I have for some time now, longer than I have allowed myself to admit, and I am asking, if you will have me, for the chance to build a life together, one where you never again have to wonder whether you belong in this house, because you will belong here as its mistress, beside me, for as long as we both shall live. Tears gathered in Ilara's eyes, though these were nothing like the ones she had shed in confinement days earlier. I came here with nothing, she whispered. No family, no name worth mentioning, nothing but a letter and a hope that I would not be turned away. You came here, Julian corrected gently, with exactly what this house needed most, kindness, patience, the courage to sit with grief instead of running from it. I do not care what name you carry, Ilara. I only care that you stay. Then yes, she said, laughing softly through her tears. Yes, I will stay. I will marry you, Julian. Solomon, as though understanding every word exchanged between them, chose that exact moment to lower himself once more to his knees in the golden evening light, bowing before them both as he had bowed for Alara that very first night, as though offering his own quiet blessing to a match he had somehow recognized long before either of them dared to. Julian laughed, a full and unguarded sound that Alara realized she had never once heard from him before that moment, and pulled her into his arms, the two of them standing together in the stable yard as the last light of day faded gently into evening, the grief that had once filled every corner of Ashcombe Hall finally, quietly, beginning to heal. The wedding took place in early autumn, a modest affair by the standards of great houses, held in the very paddock where Alara had first proven herself worthy of Solomon's trust. Odette wept openly through the entire ceremony. Even Gideon, humbled and grateful for the second chance he had been given, stood among the gathered staff with genuine warmth in his expression, as the new Duchess of Ashcombe exchanged her vows beneath a canopy of autumn leaves. Solomon stood nearby throughout the ceremony, unrestrained, trusted completely, his dark eyes following Alara with the same devotion he had shown since that first moonlit night. And when the vows were finally spoken and Julian kissed his bride before the assembled household, the great stallion let out a soft, contented sound, as though he too understood that the long grief of Ashcombe Hall had finally, truly, come to an end. Alara Ashcombe rode beside her husband that evening as the sun set over the estate that was now, impossibly, entirely her own, Solomon beneath her exactly as he had once carried the mother-in-law she would never meet, carrying forward a legacy of gentleness and quiet strength that would shape Ashcombe Hall for generations to come. Winter came early that year, dusting the fields around Ashcombe Hall in a thin layer of frost that turned the paddock silver each morning, and Alara found herself standing at the stable door before dawn, exactly as she had on her very first day in this house, though everything about her circumstances had changed beyond recognition. She was Duchess now, a title she still sometimes forgot to answer to when addressed by the younger staff, but her mornings had not changed at all. She still rose before the household, still made her way to the stable in the cold gray light, still found Solomon waiting for her at the door of his stall with the same quiet devotion he had shown since the night he first knelt before her. Julian found her there most mornings now, no longer pretending his presence was accidental, no longer inventing reasons to explain why the Duke of Ashcombe spent so much time near the stables at dawn. He simply came, leaned against the paddock fence beside his wife, and watched the sun rise over land that felt, for the first time in years, entirely at peace. Percival had remained at Ashcombe Hall after his mother's departure, humbled by the scandal, and determined to build a life for himself, separate from her ambitions. He apprenticed himself to the estate's steward, learning the honest management of land and tenants rather than the scheming his mother had once hoped would secure his future, and slowly, carefully, he began to earn back a measure of trust from a household that had watched his mother's downfall with wary eyes. Corinne herself had settled in a smaller property 2 counties away, her letters to her son growing shorter and less frequent with each passing season, the consequences of her choices following her long after she had left Ashcombe Hall behind. Gideon remained head groom, though he had softened considerably since the night Solomon broke free to find Alara in her confinement. He never again raised his voice around the stallion, and in time, he became one of the few staff members Solomon tolerated besides Alara herself, a quiet testament to how thoroughly the old grief of the estate had finally begun to lift. Odette, ever watchful, took particular pride in the new Duchess's rise, often telling anyone who would listen that she had known from the very first week that the quiet stable girl was destined for something greater than mucking out stalls. She remained head housekeeper, fiercely protective of Alara, and became something between a mother and a trusted friend in the years that followed, a bond neither of them had expected but both cherished deeply. As for Solomon, he lived out his years exactly as his old mistress would have wished, carrying the new Duchess across the same fields he had once carried her predecessor, his grief long since softened into something gentler, something closer to peace. Visitors to Ashcombe Hall often remarked on the unusual sight of the great black stallion following the Duchess around the paddock like a devoted shadow, kneeling for her still on quiet mornings when no one else was watching, a private ritual between the two of them that spoke of a bond neither time nor tragedy had ever managed to break. Alara often thought back to that first terrified morning, the scream from the stable, the horse everyone believed too far gone to save, and marveled at how completely her life had transformed since that single trembling decision to step toward fear instead of away from it. She had arrived at Ashcombe Hall with nothing but a letter and a hope of simple survival, and she had found, instead, a family, a home, and a love she had never dared imagine for herself. She thought, too, of her mother, of the quiet connection between their two lives that had once been wielded as a weapon, and had instead become, in the end, nothing more than a gentle thread tying her past to her present, proof that she had always belonged in these halls, long before she ever understood why. On the anniversary of that first night, the night Solomon had knelt before her beneath a full moon and changed the course of both their lives, Ilara stood once more at the paddock fence beside her husband, watching their own daughter, barely old enough to walk, reach small fingers toward the great stallion's lowered head. Solomon, gentle now in a way none of the old staff would have believed possible in those early days, lowered himself carefully to his knees before the child, offering her the same quiet devotion he had once offered her mother, as though he understood that the family he had grieved for so painfully had not been lost at all, but simply reborn, generation after generation, in the golden light of every new Ashcombe morning. And Ilara, watching her husband lift their daughter gently onto the horse's broad back, felt the last remnants of the fear and loneliness that had once defined her entire life dissolve completely into the warm, steady peace of a home she had never expected to find, and would never, for as long as she lived, take for granted again.